There is a quiet contradiction in how we live now. We have unprecedented access to comfort, information, and choice, and yet the inner atmosphere of many lives feels crowded, unsettled, slightly out of reach. Not in a dramatic way, more like a low, constant noise that never fully leaves. We organize, optimize, and upgrade. We improve what can be measured, but something less visible resists this logic. A person can have a well-designed life on the outside and still feel internally unstructured, as if there is no real place to return to within themselves. This is not a failure of effort, it is a misalignment of attention, because the inner life does not respond to the same principles as the external one. The deeper problem is subtle. Modern systems are designed around acquisition. More information, more options, more visibility, more control. And over time, this orientation begins to shape how we relate to everything, including ourselves. We start to approach the inner world as something to improve, optimize, or even fix. We consume ideas about clarity, calm, and purpose, but rarely pause long enough for any of it to settle into something lived. The end result is a quiet build-up, without any merging. Thoughts become knowledgeable but not stable. Emotions are expressed but not understood. Attention is active but rarely at rest. This creates a form of internal fragmentation that is easy to overlook because it appears functional on the surface. A person can think clearly in moments, feel deeply in fragments, and still experience an underlying sense of disconnection from themselves. Not because something is missing, but because nothing is given enough continuity to take shape. The speed of life today makes this pattern stronger. Attention is constantly being interrupted, redirected, and brought back. Each interruption may seem small, but over time it stops deeper internal structures from forming. There isn't much room for thoughts to fully develop, little tolerance for unresolved questions, little patience for silence, and so the inner life becomes reactive rather than intentional, formed by what enters it, rather than by how it is held. This is not a personal shortcoming, it is a structural condition. We are surrounded by systems that reward speed, responsiveness, and constant engagement. Depth, by contrast, requires slowness, repetition, and a willingness to remain with something beyond its immediate usefulness. Without these conditions, the inner world does not disappear. It simply remains unformed, present but without coherence. And over time, this lack of inner structure creates a subtle fatigue. Not the fatigue of doing too much, but the fatigue of never fully arriving within one's own experience. A sense that the mind is always in motion, but rarely at rest within itself. To speak of an inner life that cannot be bought is to shift the focus from accumulation to architecture. It is not about how much you know, feel, or experience, but about how these elements are arranged within you. An unstructured inner life can hold a great deal and still feel scattered. A well-structured one may hold less and yet feel complete. This distinction is easy to overlook because most external systems reward accumulation, but the inner world responds to a different principle. It responds to form. There are three quiet elements that shape this form. The first is coherence. Coherence is the gradual alignment between what you pay attention to, what you value, and how you move through the world. It does not require certainty. It requires honesty. When something matters, it is not just acknowledged. It is given space in your thinking, your time, and your decisions. And when something does not matter, it is allowed to pass without being absorbed simply because it is available or persuasive. Without coherence, the inner life becomes crowded with borrowed priorities. Ideas that sound meaningful but are not personally examined. Desires that feel urgent but are not deeply chosen. This creates internal friction, a sense of moving in multiple directions at once. Coherence reduces this friction, not by simplifying life externally, but by clarifying what is internally consistent. It is built slowly through reflection and through the quiet discipline of not adopting everything that appears valuable. The second element is depth of attention, not intensity, but depth. Intensity moves quickly, it seeks stimulation, reacts to novelty, and often fades just as quickly. Depth lingers. It allows a thought to extend beyond its first interpretation. It stays with a question without needing immediate resolution. It returns to the same idea from different angles, allowing it to reveal layers that are not visible at the surface. Most environments are designed to interrupt this depth, to keep attention moving rather than settling. And over time, this conditions the mind to expect constant change rather than sustained presence. Reclaiming depth is not about effort in the conventional sense. It is about permitting stillness, allowing attention to remain with one thing long enough for it to unfold. This changes the texture of thought itself. It becomes less reactive, less fragmented, and more continuous. A single idea begins to carry more weight than many disconnected ones. The third element is interior independence. This is a quieter, less visible quality. It is the ability to experience your thoughts and emotions without immediately turning them outward, without needing to express, validate, or resolve them in real time. This is not suppression, it is containment, a recognition that not everything within you needs to become external to be meaningful. In the absence of this independence, the inner life becomes porous, constantly shaped by response, feedback, and visibility. But when there is some degree of internal sufficiency, a different stability emerges. You can sit with an idea without needing to share it. You can feel something without needing to explain it. You can question something without needing immediate answers. This creates a private continuity, a sense that your inner life is not entirely dependent on external interaction to exist or to deepen. Together, these three elements, coherence, depth of attention, and interior independence, form a kind of internal architecture. They do not eliminate complexity, they give it shape. And when the inner world has shape, it becomes inhabitable, not something you occasionally visit, but something you can quietly return to, again and again, without urgency, without noise, without the need to add more. This is where the idea of clarity begins to shift in a more subtle direction. Conventionally, clarity is defined by access. More comfort, more options, more refinement in what can be owned or experienced. It can be seen, measured, and often compared. But there is another kind of clarity that doesn't fit into this framework. It doesn't care about having more, it cares about needing less. The clarity of a mind that isn't always fighting with itself, where choices aren't constantly being made again and again, and where focus isn't always being split. This has a quiet ease to it that people don't often talk about but really feel. It reduces internal friction, the clarity of being able to pay attention for a long time, to stay with one thought or experience and not feel the need to move on or add something else to it. This kind of continuity is hard to find in a world where things are always changing, and rarity, in a deeper sense, is what has always defined clarity. Then there is the clarity of interior privacy, a life in which not every thought is externalized, not every feeling displayed, not every insight shared for acknowledgement. Something remains within, not hidden, but held. This creates a different relationship with oneself, less performative, less reactive, and more intact. These forms of clarity do not announce themselves. They are not immediately visible to others, but they change the quality of experience in a fundamental way. They soften the need for excess. They reduce the dependence on constant input. They allow clarity to emerge not as something pursued, but as something that naturally appears when there is less internal noise. In contrast, much of what is commonly pursued operates on accumulation. More information, more engagement, more visibility. But without structure, accumulation leads to saturation, and saturation makes it difficult to perceive what actually matters. So this reframing is not about rejecting the external world. It is about understanding that the logic of inner richness is different. One that is calmer, more controlled, and less focused on growth. A way of thinking that sees the lack of excess as a form of improvement. Something starts to change over time. The need to always be involved with everything starts to fade, not by force but by slowly changing what seems necessary. When the inner life becomes more coherent, more settled, more self-contained, much of the external noise loses its urgency. You begin to notice that not everything requires your attention, not every thought needs to be followed, not every feeling needs to be resolved immediately. There is space, and within that space a quieter form of clarity appears, not the clarity of having all the answers, but the clarity of not being internally divided, of sensing what belongs and what can pass without resistance. This is not an end state, it is an ongoing arrangement, a way of shaping your inner world so that it becomes a place you can return to without effort. And perhaps that is the quiet realization. An inner life does not become rich through accumulation. It becomes rich through form, through the careful structuring of attention, meaning, and silence. And in a world that offers endless ways to fill the mind, there is something deeply restful about no longer needing to.